Well, hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Yanc. I'm the program director at the Loft Cinema, and I'd like to thank you for joining me tonight for this discussion, this virtual discussion of one of my very favorite movies thus far this year, Shirley. And I am coming to you tonight live from the abandoned Loft Cinema office. I don't know if this space is quite as haunted as some of the spaces that Shirley Jackson was fond of writing about, but let's see what happens. I could be driven mad tonight at any moment. So Shirley is, for those of you who have seen it and those of you who have not, I hope you've all seen this, is an imagined biopic. So it's very unusual. It's not a traditional movie biography by a long shot. It's based on a novel, this novel here, Shirley, a novel by Susan Scarf Merrill. And great novel. I read this when it came out a few years ago, and the movie has inspired me to want to read it again, for sure. So this is a very unusual film. It's beautiful and it's spooky and it's sad and twisted and unsettling. A lot like the fiction of Shirley Jackson. And it also, of course, stars Elisabeth Moss as Shirley Jackson, and pretty much any film starring Elisabeth Moss is going to be worth a watch. In my book, I think she's definitely one of the finest contemporary actresses we have working right now, all the way back from the Mad Men days as Peggy on Mad Men, and of course, The Handmaid's Tale. If you saw the couple of films that showed here at the Loft, like Her Smell, Girl Interrupted, going way back in her career, The One I Love, which we showed here at the Loft, and recently this year, The Invisible Man, which was a great twist on the classic Universal horror film starring Elisabeth Moss, and she completely owned that film, and she's great. So this is directed by Josephine Decker, whom some of you may remember directed a film that we also showed here at the Loft in 2018 called Madeline's Madeline, which starred Miranda July, and written by Sarah Gubbins, who I really admire because she is the producer and one of the writers for the show Better Things, which I think is one of the great TV shows on right now. It's on the FX channel and other platforms as well. She also was one of the producers and writers on the show I Love Dick. And I was informed today, luckily enough, I'm going to have the great honor of getting to host a virtual Q&A with both the director and the writer of Shirley next Friday, June 26th. So please join us for that. We'll be sending out details. Not sure about the time exactly. Possibly one of the actors, maybe Elisabeth Moss. I'm not going to hold my breath, but boy, that would be exciting. So I just kind of wanted to set the scene for Shirley. I'm not sure how much everyone knows about Shirley Jackson, the writer, but I think knowing just a little bit about where she came from, what kind of a headspace she was in when she was doing her the bulk of her famous work like Haunting of Hill House and The Lottery, really kind of helps inform this film. This film is, of course, as I mentioned, a fictionalized take on the life of Shirley Jackson. It was intended to, both the novel and the film were intended to be written and directed in the style of a Shirley Jackson short story or novel. And of course, she wrote in the gothic horror mystery genre, which means there's lots of suppressed emotions and buttoned up sexuality and maybe some madness, possibly some ghosts popping up. Real or imagined. That's part of the Gothic genre, of course. She's definitely one of my favorite 20th century authors. Died in 1965. Her career since she died has been reevaluated. But in her lifetime, she was really dismissed, apparently, by serious literary critics who pigeonholed her as a horror writer, strictly a horror writer, which I don't know if I'd really call her a horror writer necessarily. They called her a high-toned horror writer, and one very snarky critic referred to her as Virginia Werewolf, which I guess was probably funny. But she was a fascinating person, a fascinating writer. She was hugely successful as an author. She had a very dark, kind of macabre public persona. She tended to use demons and ghosts and other Gothic paraphernalia in her stories. She also loved to publicly proclaim herself to be a witch, which really ruffled some people's feathers in the 1950s. She also was fond of bragging to journalists that she placed hexes on various prominent publishers when she didn't appreciate what they were doing with her novels. But she was also, at the same time, or at least she seemed on the surface to be what in the 1950s was considered to be a average housewife and mother of 4 kids. And she wrote, which a lot of people don't know about Shirley Jackson, if you only know her from her kind of Gothic mystery novels, is that she was also very, very funny. She wrote 2 collections of parenting tips about her children and how harried she was trying to keep track of her kids. And these were called Raising Demons and Life Among the Savages, which are great if you haven't read them. They're very funny. But they really show that she had this other side that was not often explored, this kind of darkly funny persona and a loving mother. Not something that you would expect from the kind of spooky, twisted persona that she projected as the author of The Haunting of Hill House. And so as we saw in the movie, and as we know, if we know Shirley Jackson's work, she became very famous in 1948 for writing the short story The Lottery, which a lot of us read in college or in high school English literature class. And this is the movie that sort of launched her career. The movie points out that this was originally published in the New Yorker magazine in 1948, and it still to this day apparently holds the record of getting the most number of concerned letters and calls to the New Yorker offices about a story they published. People were apparently very freaked out by the lottery. They couldn't quite understand what was happening, why it was so dark and twisted. But that was really sort of a great introduction to Shirley Jackson for American readers because she took them on quite a wild ride. She wrote 6 novels, those 2 essay collections, which I mentioned about raising kids, and over 200 short stories, novels like my collection here. We've Always Lived in the Castle, Hangs a Man, which is features very prominently in the movie Shirley. The Lottery, of course, the short story, and there's a whole collection. That was her first collection of short stories. And probably one of her most famous novels, The Haunting of Hill House, which has been turned into at least 2 films and 1 Netflix series, and has haunted my dreams for many, many years when I first read that in high school. So Shirley Jackson's kind of sorceress persona has been looked at by critics in the ensuing years since she passed away as sort of maybe shtick that she loved, sort of putting a joke over on journalists who were interviewing her. She liked to have fun with them, so she liked to kind of spook them by saying that she was a sorceress and that she was going to put a hex on them. But also a lot of particularly feminist critics who have reevaluated Shirley Jackson's work have really looked at her as embracing this witch persona as a way of her sort of trying to empower herself as a woman in an era of the 1950s when women did not necessarily generally have a lot of power. So we can also kind of look at the kind of the witchy subtext of a lot of her books in terms of her trying to empower herself as a woman, which I find very interesting about her. She also grew up with a very complicated mother named Gertrude. And there's a great biography of Shirley Jackson called A Rather Haunted Life, which came out about 10 years ago by Ruth Franklin. And she gets into exactly what was going on with Gertrude. But Shirley Jackson's mother was not great. And knowing about Shirley Jackson's mother, I think, really informs the Shirley Jackson you see in the film Shirley. Gertrude was extremely critical of Shirley Jackson's writing as a young girl. Shirley Jackson knew very early on that she wanted to be a writer. Gertrude basically criticized her weight, her hair, her looks, her writing, her very existence. Shirley Jackson has said that as a young girl, she saw herself as an outsider. She thought the world was judging her. She thought the world was cruel. And she has this great quote that she says that her childhood writing was, quote, born out of a mindset where I used to think that no one had ever been so lonely as I was, and I used to write about people who were all alone. I thought I was insane, and I would write about how the only sane people are the ones who are condemned as mad, and how the whole world is cruel and foolish and afraid of people who are different, which is kind of sad, but knowing that about her really sort of, I think, informs the stories that she wrote, which were really about a lot of outsiders, mostly all women who were sort of marginalized in society, maybe misunderstood, maybe called witches. And most of Shirley Jackson's adult life was apparently devoted to rebelling against her mother, Gertrude, who one day told her, I am so sad all day about what you have allowed yourself to look like, Shirley. So that was pretty horrible. So Shirley Jackson left, went to college, met Stanley Edgar Hyman, the man she eventually married that we see in the film, the not so great husband. In 1940, they got married. And in her relationship with Stanley, of course, critics seem to think that she found someone who could sort of take up the mantle for her abusive relationship with her mother, which is kind of psychologically interesting. But as we saw in the film, she and her husband had a very complicated relationship. He demanded an open relationship, which Shirley was not really crazy about, but she didn't feel like she had a lot of options. So he got to have a lot of affairs with his former students. He was an English teacher at Bennington College, and he controlled her finances even after she published The Lottery, and she became much more famous than he was as a writer. And she was the breadwinner of the family after that point, but he still doled out an allowance to her, which is a very maybe telling commentary on women in the 50s who wanted to also be famous writers. He was also, I think, very jealous of her and her success. And I think that sort of was borne out by the way he treated her. And we see that in the film. How her career completely eclipsed his own. And most interestingly, the two of them had 4 children. And there's no mention of the children in the film. So that was a very specific omission by the screenwriter and the director to not include the children. The children are referenced in the novel. And of course, and we could talk about that in a moment. And of course, she struggled her whole life with anxiety and depression and extreme agoraphobia. There was a period when she didn't leave the house for a couple of years. And she directed a lot of her rage in her writing at Stanley, even though she stayed with him until she died in 1965. And you see the revenge in a lot of her fiction, where she creates these characters of these incredibly pompous men who try to control women. She also created a lot of pretty funny revenge cartoons against Stanley that maybe he didn't notice were about him or didn't care were about him, where she would draw a picture of herself serving him entrails for dinner or sneaking up behind him with a big axe aimed at his head. And of course, most of her fiction was about women kind of on the verge of breakdowns of various sorts. And she was very much in the Gothic tradition of novelists like Bronte, particularly Jane Eyre, the kind of Gothic trope of the mad woman locked away that we see in Jane Eyre is very prevalent in We Have Always Lived in the Castle and in The Haunting of Hill House and in Hangs a Man, which we can talk about in a minute. And so finally, just to kind of sum all that up, Shirley Jackson had probably the best quote to describe her own career when she wrote, quote, "My entire career, I write of neuroses and fear, and I think all of my books laid end to end would be one long documentation of pure anxiety." And that's probably was probably great for her as a writer, but probably not great for her in terms of living happily ever after. And she died at the age of 48 for health complications. She had smoking issues and weight issues and a lot of other things. So that's sort of a background of Shirley Jackson and her writing, and kind of leads us into the movie Shirley. So I'm curious, anyone who's here, what you think about this idea of Shirley, the movie, as a biopic. I know I saw this film at Sundance back in January when it premiered, and the director and the screenwriter were there, and the cast was there. And a lot of people said they were a little, not disappointed, but maybe a little confused because they went into the film expecting a traditional film biography. And it's certainly not that. So I'm curious if anyone had that experience going into it, if you thought this was going to be more of a traditional, this happened, and this happened, and this happened to Shirley Jackson, and then she died. And if so, if that disappointed you, this is really just a slice of time in Shirley Jackson's life. And it's imagined, even though there are a lot of real elements in the script in terms of what was going on in that period of time. So interestingly, the novel is set in 1964, which is after Shirley Jackson had published her final novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle. The movie is set in 1948, so that was right when she had published The Lottery in The New Yorker, and that's right when she was on the cusp of becoming a very famous writer. So I think that's very interesting that the screenwriter moved the time frame, and I think she did that so that she could introduce the plot element, which is not in the book, of having Shirley Jackson working on the novel Hangs a Man, which came right after The Lottery. It was her second novel, and she did that right after she published The Lottery. And, let's take a break here. Let's see what Ben has to say. I think traditional film biopics are pretty tired and formulaic at this point. It suggests a sense of realism that isn't actually present. I think Shirley presents a wonderful alternative. Yes, I totally agree. I think we have plenty of straight-up biopics. We didn't need one about Shirley Jackson. There's written biographies of her that we can read if we want to know about that. But this is much more interesting, I think. Of course, the movie is about two younger folks, a couple, Rose and Fred, who come to live with Shirley and Stanley in Benetton when Stanley's teaching at Benetton College, and Shirley is a fairly unhappy faculty wife. And Rose and Shirley form this kind of strange and sort of symbiotic and little twisted and kind of erotic relationship. And they both become obsessed with the missing girl, Paula, who was a real missing girl who was in college at Bennington College and who had gone missing in the late 1940s. And that's what Shirley Jackson is writing about in Hangs a Man. That's the impetus for the novel. So both Rose and Shirley become obsessed with the mystery of this missing girl, Paula. And that sort of forms the framework for the story, is that two women are coming together over a shared mystery, which is why in a lot of ways this film, the screenplay reminds me a bit of David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, which of course is about two women who come together to solve a mystery. And in the movie, Shirley, you may note that both of the women sort of meld into each other, and I'm curious what everyone thinks about that, like what exactly that means. A lot in this film is ambiguous and left deliberately ambiguous, which I think is why it's interesting and why it's fun to talk about this film. That element of it reminds me of also another film from Robert Altman called Three Women, in which Sissy Spacek, this was from 1977, when Sissy Spacek becomes obsessed with Shelley Duvall and starts absorbing her personality, and they essentially create this third woman. And it's all very dreamlike and hypnotic and primal and subconscious. And I will be interested when we have our Q&A with the filmmaker and the screenwriter if that film Three Women was an influence on the screenplay for Shirley, because certainly there's a lot of similarities there. So I want to talk about the first scene in Shirley. So if you've seen Shirley, you know the scene I'm talking about. Rose and Fred are on the train making their way to Vermont. And Rose is reading the lottery story in the New Yorker on the train, and she becomes very sexually aroused reading the story. And it signals right off the bat that Rose is perhaps a little dark. Because, of course, if you've read The Lottery, which I think most of us have, you know that that's a pretty twisted story. And then she and her husband run off into the bathroom on the train and have sex. But it also sort of signals another theme of the film, which I think is the erotic power of talent and of writing. And I think it kind of helps frame why Rose becomes so obsessed with Shirley, because she's so drawn to Shirley's power as a writer. And it becomes not only about Shirley's identity, but it also becomes sexual in the pretty amazing scene on the porch swing. If you remember that scene where Shirley is swinging on the porch swing and Rose comes up to her and they begin bumping knees together and they get closer and closer together. And that scene is really kind of an incredible visualization of two women who are sort of coming together in a very complicated way. And it never becomes full-blown sexual, but there's a lot of sexual tension running throughout, which we also see in the story Haunting of Hill House and in the movie The Haunting, which was made in 1960. Two women sort of drawn together in this house with a sexual attraction to each other, but there's ghosts involved. Pretty great. I think another interesting structure. Oh, let's see what Brandon Knight's here. What does he have to say? I loved it. More of an impression or a glimpse into Shirley's life, work, and psyche, similar to Capote. Yeah, similar to Capote, the Philip Seymour Hoffman film, for sure. Which interesting, the Capote film was also about Truman Capote writing in cold blood. So it was specifically about the writing process, much as the film Shirley is about her writing Hangs a Man, and it's kind of becoming obsessed with her subject, much like Capote became obsessed with the real-life murder suspects in his story in Cold Blood. So yeah, that's a good comparison. There's a lot of connections there for sure. I'm also wondering how everyone thought about the framework of, it's hard to watch Shirley and not think about Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Because the Edward Albee play and the movie with Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor, of course. And of course, that story is about an older academic couple at a college and a younger couple who comes to their house, and the older couple essentially attempts to destroy this younger couple and plays mind games with them. And there's seductions, and there's drinking, and there's mental illness, and there's secrets revealed. Clearly, Shirley is influenced by that. And this is sort of like the George and Martha story, but with ghosts, perhaps. But I think the screenplay is smart that it doesn't tip its hat to become too explicit of a reference point for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. But it's definitely there for sure. So the way the film is structured also, I wanted to talk a little bit about the house in Shirley. Now, Shirley Jackson, as we know, as I mentioned, and as we see in the film, was stricken with agoraphobia for most of her adult life, and it became more severe and less severe over time. But she really had a thing for writing about houses and the way houses can sort of overwhelm you and consume you and trap you. Of course, The Haunting of Hill House is the most, I think, explicit example where the house is actually a living entity that traps Eleanor in the house. But in Shirley, I think we see nods to The Haunting of Hill House, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which has a similar vibe with the two sisters who become basically trapped in that decaying mansion. And that film was also a little like Grey Gardens, but that's a whole other story. I mean, that story is like Grey Gardens. But in Shirley, I think we can really look at the production design as a major character in Shirley. That house is incredible. It's just sort of overpoweringly cluttered and oppressive, and it's in the middle of the woods, and so it's kind of dark and kind of dank, and it feels like a living entity. In the novel, the Shirley novel here, the Rose character actually refers to the house as a living thing, and she thinks that the house is sort of watching her and dictating her every move. And she actually becomes as obsessed with the house as she becomes with Shirley, which is interesting. And of course, in the movie, Elisabeth Moss as Shirley Jackson has the great line, something to the effect of, "A clean house is the first sign of a demented mind," or something along those lines. But clearly, the house in Shirley is a character, and a lot of the tension that happens inside the house and the bad feelings and the relationships are sort of built out of this kind of oppressive living space that they have. And the direction of the film, Josephine Decker, and I'm really curious to talk to her about this when we do our Q&A. If you saw Madeline's Madeline, and you know that the director, has a real fondness for blurring reality and fantasy and imagined experiences. And we see that in Shirley with the Paula character, who's always sort of talked about by the two women. And we see the visualization of that with Paula wearing the red coat, and early on her face is kind of blurred out. And I'm wondering if all of you caught this. I didn't catch this the first time I saw Shirley, but then I watched it again and I caught it right away. That Paula in the imagined fantasies is actually played by the same actress who plays Rose in the film, Odessa Young. So Odessa Young is playing both Rose and Paula. It appears at one point that the Paula character is just someone who kind of looks like Rose, but then she actually becomes the same actress who's playing Rose, which is a real mind trip, and it's very complicated and layered. But really, I think Josephine Decker is really becoming sort of a master of that kind of blurring of the lines between reality and imagination. Really, really great job directing this film. And of course, the discordant music in the film makes me think this is the horror film, and I'm curious if people view this as a horror film. Some critics have talked about Shirley as a horror film, I think because Shirley Jackson is known as a horror writer. And I think the film is really filled with that sense of vague unease and dread that all of Shirley Jackson's novels are filled with. I don't know if I would call it an outright horror film, but if you think otherwise, please let me know. But it is definitely, again, I think in the Gothic mystery tradition, which is maybe not necessarily horror. I think it's also interesting to talk about the relationship between Shirley and Stanley. Now, Stanley, of course, is played by Michael Stuhlbarg in the film, and I think we all remember him as the dad in Call Me By Your Name, and he had that amazing speech at the end of that film. I think he's a great actor. Was also in The Shape of Water last 2 years ago, and he was in A Serious Man, the Coen Brothers film. And he clearly indicates that Stanley is a creep, just oppressive, kind of beating Shirley down, criticizing her, making her feel terrible about herself, questioning her writing. But when I watched the film a second time, I had a somewhat different take on what their relationship was. When I first saw it, it felt like it was all about Stanley oppressing Shirley. But when I thought about it through the lens of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and kind of this couple of Shirley and Stanley sort of inviting these young people into their home with the hopes of destroying them, they kind of look like, at certain moments when they're sitting around the kitchen table and Shirley and Stanley are exchanging glances, they look like trolls under the bridge who have just invited children to walk across the bridge so they can snatch them and drag them under the water. And I think the movie's complicated in that way because clearly it has sympathy for Shirley and the oppression that she was feeling at the hands of her husband. But I think it also implies that there was sort of a shared perversity between the two of them in terms of wanting to sort of consume these younger folks who enter into their home. So just a quick note from Brandon. Love the camera work, intimate to the point of claustrophobia. Reminded me of Julian Schnabel. Yes, very Schnabel-esque. And it matches Shirley's mindset, sustained mood. Yeah, the movie really does sort of match what's going on in her head, I think, the visual effects in the film. So just something to think about, that relationship between Stanley and Shirley. And I think Michael Stuhlbarg is a great actor, and I think he is able to give that character of Stanley more shadings than I think a cursory glance at that character might imply, that he's just a completely terrible person, which he seems to be a completely terrible person. But there's more perversity underneath the surface of that relationship, I think. And I think this really bears out in the final scene of the film, and I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on the finale of Shirley. So basically, we've had Rose turn into Shirley Jackson. And I think it's interesting visually. The two women sort of change their aesthetic. At the end of the film, Rose looks a little bit like Shirley Jackson did at the beginning of the film. She has disheveled. At the beginning, Rose is very coiffed, very neatly clothed. At the end, she's kind of frazzled and disheveled. Her hair's all over the place. She seems somewhat bedraggled. She's just had a baby and she's had kind of a horrible experience. Whereas Shirley has now finished her novel, Hangs a Man, and she has the coiffed hair and the pins in it, and she's got the lipstick on, and at one point towards the end, she's wearing Rose's yellow skirt and the flower print blouse, which looks like a very un-Shirley Jackson-like outfit. So the women have sort of swapped places in a lot of ways. But the last scene in the film is Shirley and her husband Stanley dancing in the kitchen, and Shirley saying, this was the most painful, this novel hurt more than any other novel I've written. And Stanley saying, oh, this is great, but I have some notes for you. but they both start laughing and hugging, and it seems like this relationship is really born out of this kind of masochistic, sadistic dance the two of them do with each other. And it seems like it's going to be that way as she keeps writing and goes through the process of writing, and then she finishes a novel, and then she's fine again, and then he criticizes her, beats her down, she writes the novel. So it looks like a happy ending on the surface because she's finished this novel, Hangs a Man, which is a great novel. But clearly there's sort of a diseased relationship here that's going on that's not healthy in terms of the writer and her husband. And I think what that also really sort of plays up is the kind of the jealousy and the kind of resentment that Stanley feels towards Shirley. As I mentioned, like she, as a writer, very easily eclipsed his career as a writer. And I think that was one reason he tried to keep her unsure of herself because of his kind of anger towards her for that. And I think, interestingly, I think Stanley seems to be jealous of not only Shirley Jackson's writing talent, but also of her madness. Because he approaches writing, he's a literary critic, and he approaches writing very technically and academically, whereas she just dives in and she lives it, and she's imagining things, and she's sort of falling apart while she's writing this novel. And I think he resents that she has the ability to jump into the abyss and then pull herself out again. And really experience true madness and create these amazing, kind of wonderful, strange, almost primal novels that he would never be able to write. So there's something about the idea of true artists being touched by madness that I think is a recurring theme throughout Shirley, which is also very interesting and also, of course, a very destructive kind of idea. I also just want to take a moment to talk about Paula. So the real life girl from Bennington College who went missing, and that case was never solved, by the way, in real life. So no one knows what happened to Paula. But Shirley Jackson, in real life and in the movie, became obsessed with the story of Paula and what happened to her, as did Rose. The novel Shirley is an interesting counterpoint because the novel is set in 1965, so Hangs a Man was written in 1951, so it had already been written almost 2 decades prior, or a decade and a half prior. And the disappearance of Paula is discussed in the novel, and Rose in the novel becomes convinced that Shirley Jackson and possibly Stanley, her husband, had something to do with the disappearance of Paula and possibly what she envisioned as the murder of Paula. And when the novel came out, there was criticism of the novel that the author of Shirley, a novel, was basically insinuating that Shirley Jackson had kidnapped and possibly murdered Paula with the help of Stanley. And that's a very interesting wrinkle. I mean, clearly that's not true, but I think the movie does a very interesting job of implying that possibly Stanley and or Shirley knows more about the disappearance of Paula than they're letting on. And it's certainly plausible that Stanley in the movie had a relationship with Paula because he slept with a lot of his students, and she was one of the students at Bennington when he was teaching there. But Paula really represents this doppelganger doubling effect that is in a lot of Shirley Jackson's novels. She loved a good doppelganger, and who doesn't? But really, Paula seems like, as I mentioned, a double for Rose. And in a lot of ways, she's also a double or a doppelganger for Shirley Jackson. Of course, a lot of Shirley Jackson's fiction was about women who become lost, whether it's in the woods or in a house or inside of their own minds. And so it's almost like Shirley Jackson is sort of obsessively investigating the fact that she herself has become lost through this character of Paula, this imagined character of Paula, and trying to unravel the mystery. It's very interesting, but I don't think that Shirley Jackson kidnapped and murdered Paula. But the novel implies that fictionally, allegedly. So it looks like we're kind of, we're already coming to an end here. If anyone has any final thoughts on Shirley, please throw them my way. Yes, here's Nate here. Let's see. Interesting framing device in the film to have the younger couple as a surrogate for Stanley and Shirley, and therefore can portray two different eras in their life at the same time. Yes. And it's interesting because I think Shirley sees in Rose the young budding writer that she was early on. And I think in terms of the doubling of the doppelganger effect, it's interesting. Fred, the young husband that comes to stay with them, also starts to become like Stanley, in that he clearly reveres Stanley's life, but maybe in a less interesting way, because Fred just really seems to want to get on the faculty of Bennington so he can sleep with students, which is creepy. But he gets that job and he starts doing that and having affairs, which sort of drives Rose over the edge. So in effect, he does become the younger version of Stanley. And it's interesting in the novel, Shirley, the novel continues after Shirley Jackson dies. So we see what happened with Fred and Rose after the fact. And Rose actually gets in contact with Shirley Jackson's real life children. It's very interesting. I would highly recommend it. Shirley, the novel, has just been reissued because of the movie. So it's in print again. It was out of print for a while. But really, if you haven't read a lot of Shirley Jackson, or if you maybe have only read The Lottery and Haunting of Hill House, there is a wealth of great literature. I mean, she was a fascinating woman who was living in a very hard time for women who wanted to be writers. And she really sort of tapped into something very primal and dark about that experience, and made it very, it's not bitter, but it is, it's very clear that she was not happy. But she's also very morbidly funny. So that's a great combination, I think. Bitter and funny and angry and great writer. So I guess that's it for Shirley. If you haven't seen Shirley yet, please make sure to check it out. It's still streaming through the Loft Cinema and will be for a couple of weeks still. Definitely one of the more interesting films to come out this year. And just a reminder, I'll be moderating a Q&A with the director and the writer of Shirley, and fingers crossed, maybe one of the stars, Elisabeth Moss. I'm going to keep putting out the vibes for Elisabeth Moss, who is definitely one of my very favorite actresses now, with one of the best faces in Hollywood. That face can convey any emotion. Nobody glares like Elisabeth Moss, I will say. So thank you for joining me. Please keep an eye on the Loft Cinema. We are still closed. We will be reopening soon. The date is TBA. Hopefully it's not too far off, but we're monitoring things closely so that we can reopen safely and responsibly. But we are very much looking forward to coming back and seeing you at the movies, in the theater, in a theatrical setting, as movies should be seen. So thank you very much, and thanks for watching, and please read some Shirley Jackson. Good night.